Kimber's a writer, historian who's been based in Alice Springs for the past 45 years. He's published widely in areas of Aboriginal art and culture and Central Australian history. He's travelled extensively in Australia's deserts, often with traditional owners, and has an abiding interest in Australian desert ecology. He shares his love of the outback with his wife, Marg Friedel, an arid lands ecologist with CSIRO for over 40 years based in Alice Springs. Together they plan to continue travelling in the remoter parts of desert Australia, learning as they go for as long as they can. Thanks, Dick and Margaret.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, everybody. I'm speaking on behalf of Dick, who is the brains behind this paper, and I encourage you to read Dick's T-shirt later, which says, "Historian, the second oldest profession in the world." Okay, so almost the quote from Gamage, almost everyone accepts that. I think that we want to talk about this issue of mosaic burning, which has become almost a mantra, I suppose, and just to see if, in fact, it is one of those things that's quite as universal as people perhaps think that it is. And so a definition first. Mosaic burning is the deliberate creation of a mosaic of patches representing different fire histories. So how widespread was this, and was it as universal as people suggest? The area of interest is the Lake Eyre Basin. You see that spot there, the inner part around the borders, and Dix has done an enormous amount of work on what the early explorers found. So Charles Sturt travelled from Tibooburra, wherever we are, can't see it, here it is, Tibooburra, up into this area around here, and came back, and he recorded 6 smokes. Augustus Gregory went from the Cooper Creek, and I think he ended up travelling down here. He saw no smokes. Burke and Wills went from Inaminka up, obviously right up to the Gulf, but as far as the tropic, which is about the limit, a little bit above, of our area of interest, and when they came back, 2 smokes. Howard, who then went in search of Burke and Wills, Tibooburra, and quite a lot of travel in this vicinity, no smokes. McKinlay also, following Burke and Wills, Inaminka to the Diamantina Lakes, 1 great smoke. Edgerton Warburton, Macumber over here to Inaminka and return, no smokes or fires. Lewis, Macumber River via the Lake Eyre river system, so he followed down and across to Inaminka, no smokes or fires. Lindsay, Dalhousie here and eastward, no smokes or fires. So it appears that the Channel Country experienced only a limited number of larger fires. And I should have said at the outset, the records that Dick drew out he excluded things like campfires, little local fires that everybody had, but anything that was larger that you might think constituted mosaic burning. It appears that in the Channel Country, at least, which I should have pointed it out. This is the grey is the Channel Country, Simpson Desert, Tirriri Desert, Strzelecki Desert, and the Sturt Stony Desert. And so there are possible reasons for that. It's possible that we're just simply, because it was a lot of clay soil, short grass, forb vegetation, there just wasn't the opportunity for fires so much. But the other thing is also people may not have needed to use fire because they were eating fish, water birds, nardoo, and they may not have needed it. And the other thing is the stony deserts and the salt lake country in the Simpson often didn't have the fuel in the time for most years. And by contrast, fire was relatively more common in the spinifex-dominated hills of the Simpson, so on those periphery, that western margin of the Channel Country, they were more common. So Hodgkinson travelled, he actually came down from somewhere up here on the tropic. He followed the Diamantina down in this map, which obviously people mostly can't see. It's actually called the Mueller here. But he came down to the vicinity of Birdsville, and then he travelled back northwards up the Mulligan and encountered the eastern periphery of the desert. And he saw what he said were numerous signal fires, but given the length of travel, we'd argue that that's not mosaic burning, because he travelled hundreds of kilometres. And then Winnicky, he left the Warburton, if you can remember where that is, just to the southeast of southern and eastern side of the Simpson. He travelled north up through the desert for 2 weeks, and it was so tough he actually had to give up what he was doing and head to Sandringham Station to the east. And having got there, he engaged with an Aboriginal guide and went west. And he went right across the desert to the Tarleton Range, which is on the northwestern edge of the Simpson, before returning to Sandringham by a slightly different way. He went, for those locals who know it, he went, first of all, followed the Hay down. And the only fire he saw was on that northern margin, I think around the Field River. And there are no explorers' records for the true core of the desert. But when you look at the archaeological evidence for the activities of Aboriginal people, that would be stone flakes and so on, there's far less than on the periphery. So it suggests that Aboriginal travel across the desert was relatively rare. So there's a few things that have to come together if you're thinking about the potential for fire, even before you even start thinking about mosaic burning. And that's you needed the co-occurrence in this region of spinifex sandhills, you needed people, and you also needed favourable seasons. And for example, Sturt saw no fires in the Fink and Macumber area, so that's travelling up the western side of the desert in 1860, although he did record them elsewhere, so it wasn't a matter of him not being very observant. But by contrast, Ross made that first south to north crossing of the western Simpson, and he came from the Macumber region. He was travelling in 1870, and there had been 20 inches of rain in October the year before, and he reported fires and smokes in all directions and patches of burnt country. So was this mosaic burning in the modern sense, in the definition that I gave you earlier? Now, Ross understood, he had a good understanding of why people were lighting fires, and he said they could be for signalling, so people would light sequential fires to indicate direction, for location of other groups or indications of where water could be found. They were used for hunting, but also to repel his horses because they were seen as monsters. And in 1880, Winnicky reported the whole country was on fire in the Herbert River region. So that's very much to the north of the Simpson, the northeast area. But it seems that was signalling because he reports that there were just over 100 people on a particular date, and over a certain number of days, the numbers built up till there were about 800, and there seemed to be no concern for how big this fire was. But the critical thing seems to be that it was actually a signal fire, because the Herbert River area is a really important trading centre for pitchery, the native tobacco, and so that would suggest that this wasn't this notion of mosaic burning. And it's often assumed that Aboriginal people would have used fire as a matter of course for hunting and to encourage the growth of plants. It's something that seems to have just seeped into whitefella conscience and be there as something that informs the kind of management that we try and do. Many of the explorers' records have extensive blanks about smokes and fires, as that early summary showed you, and it isn't because the explorers were not observant. They actually reported a lot about meeting up with Aboriginal people, and a lot of people living on the springs and the native wells, often in very hot weather, and making only cooking fires, which there's a very nice image from Sturt's narrative shows. Dick's discussions with old Aboriginal friends who knew the Simpson reveals that people moved as little as possible and rested in the shade. They basically tightened their belts when things were tough, when food was scarce, and it's a strategy also used by the Pintabee people, and the children were sometimes even buried in moist sand in a riverbed with a little shelter over their heads. So people were not particularly mobile. After settlement, very few people survived in Queensland. Traditional burning practices ceased. Louise Hercus tells us people migrated out of the southern Simpson by about 1901. She's from interviewing very old people from who remembered the times. But on the north and west, so in the Territory, it persisted for some longer time. And Walter Smith, who Dick has written a book about, was able to talk about the very fine-scale management that Aboriginal people did. So I think the conclusion from this is that we shouldn't be generalising about the nature of fire in the Lake Eyre Basin and potentially elsewhere, either pre-settlement or in making management recommendations, that it's not a blanket prescription. Early reports show Aboriginal people made use of fire for a lot of purposes, but they could be far apart and not necessarily constituting mosaic burning. Currents of fire was dependent on vegetation and terrain, presence of adequate fuel, whether there was something to ignite that fire, how readily people could access country and their reasons for using fire or not using fire. So the implications are that traditional Aboriginal knowledge was, Aboriginal use of fire was far more fine-grained than anything we can hope to achieve, and the question would be, do we want to achieve it? Because it's something that would be almost impossible to emulate. And where it is feasible, where fire management is feasible, it needs to be responsive to the kind of country, such as terrain and vegetation type, and it has to be relevant to management objectives. So your objective might be to prevent fire hazard, to protect an important piece of vegetation. So the message would be to use fire as appropriate and not just to think we must be mosaic burning. Assuming that it's universally applicable and desirable is probably unwise. And I'd like to thank the Aboriginal people, particularly on Dick's behalf, the people who provided the information to him, and also to Gary, who was really helpful with developing the maps. Thank you.
Boyd Wright, NT Herbarium. Just wondering, Mark, whether there might be any chance of rainfall records existing for some of those earlier explorers that recorded no fire, and whether it might be possible to link, these high and low rainfall periods with observations or lack of.
Yes, look, I've looked at it. I wrote 22,000 words before Marg said cut it back a bit. So, yes, look, I looked at all those records of rainfall and that, and you look at, say, Winnicky, he started off in flooded country down on the Warburton, and when he went up, he went with an Aboriginal guide up to a particular native well. The Aboriginal said, we shouldn't go any further, no one lives up that country, it's all sandhills and salt lakes. And then the Aboriginal guide disappeared that night, which was smart of him because fortnight's travelling, Winnicky was just about perishing by the time he had to go into Sandringham. Hadn't seen any sign of Aboriginal evidence at all. I suppose... the rainfall records, so I better focus on it. Yeah. Look, I think you can lock it in fairly well to that, but it's not totally that way. Thank you.
think the thing is there are those rainfall records where people record floods but not specific records that would tell you what was happening in more detail, say in the Simpson, around the margins. Some I expect, Boyd, but yeah. And I'm sorry, also rainfall records, for example, here go back to 1872. So, but you're talking about such big spaces that you're not necessarily able to extrapolate.
It's actually the last question just up here.
It's Fiona Walsh from Sorrow and Alice Springs. Is this working? I think Marg and Dick, to me, touch on something that's really important, is deliberateness of fire, as well as spatial variation of Aboriginal people's practice. And in the recent project on Madu lands, where we were looking at Madu concepts of traditional fire, it was actually very difficult, and there was no evidence that came through in the ethnographic work that Madu practice was really deliberate. The patterns that people spoke about were cumulative effects that were apparent in retrospect rather than in their purpose. But what's happening now is that as people have retracted from country, there is a deliberateness in the mosaicing that's being applied at very broad scale. And I think that concept of deliberate in the present is actually important in keeping fire for those spinifex grasslandscapes that are typical of the far western desert.
I'll just make one comment. I think it's important to look where fire was not done, and that's something that like if you look at, say, Bill Gamage and at Sylvia Helen, they've done great work, deserve their claim, but in fact they don't look at where there's no fire. And that, I think I got 60% out in the Tanami where there's no fire at all in the earliest records. So I think that's the same in this country. Thank you.
So that's it for time for questions. So thank you very much, Dick and Mike.